Please consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like.
Professor John J. Collins, thank you again. And this is so much fun. We're going in some really deep conversation here. One of my Patreon members, Jerry Gardner, he says, for either, and he's talking about either Dr. Baden or you, the question would be, because I was like, what do you guys want me to ask? If the Israelites were not slaves in Egypt, and there was no Exodus and city quest, how did Israel form? How did this disparate 12 tribes come together to form kingdom? Why didn't the other Canaanite groups join as well?
First of all, I am not prepared to say that there were no Hebrews who were slaves in Egypt. I would think there surely were. And there surely were many at different times. But I think what you get in the Bible is a kind of composite story where different memories get fitted together into a more or less coherent story. And there has been an awful lot of work done in the last 50 years or so on early Israel. Now, for what it's worth, I mean, this is mainly done by archaeologists. I'm not an archaeologist, and if I've learned anything from this, I know that whatever archaeologists say is going to change. It's in the nature of the business, because if they go back out to the field like summer and dig somewhere else, they'll find something that they hadn't known before was there. That's the nature of archaeology. But the current consensus on archaeology is that if you look at Israel in the period roughly 1200 to 1000, which according to the Bible is the point when Israel should have been settling in the land, coming into the land. Again, some vagueness on the dates. Now, first of all, no evidence of Egyptian influence on the culture, because you do have a change in the culture, and that is in the highlands of Canaan. You have the growth of unwalled villages. So these are not powerful people, but people moving into the highlands of Canaan. Now, the highlands of Canaan is the region around Shechem, the West Bank, basically. And that's evidently where they moved in. This fits, reasonably well with the book of Judges, because then when eventually they become strong, then they come down and attack the cities. But it takes a while. Now, no sign that they brought pots from Egypt, for example, which you would expect if they had all come out of Egypt. Where did they come from? The consensus, and the consensus now is good for the moment, but not necessarily the last word on it. The consensus is that they were Canaanites, that it was similar to what you had in Canaanite villages. One theory is that around the same time the Philistines were coming in attacking the coast, and that some of these people may have fled because of the turbulence in the lowlands. Some of them might even have rebelled against some of the city-states. That's again debatable. Norman Gottwald wrote a famous treatment of that. But they seem to have been Canaanites who fled up there. Now, somebody at some point came along and told them that they should worship the god Yahweh, who had not been worshipped in that area as far as we know before, say, 1300? As far as we know. Again, this could change, but that's the present state. Again, most of the evidence seems to be that Yahweh was a god worshipped in the south of Edom, wherever you put Mount Sinai. And now Mount Sinai probably wasn't actually down in the Sinai Peninsula. It may have been, over in what we call Midian, and some of the stories are set over there. And it seems that Yahweh was a god who was worshipped, a storm god worshipped in that area. Now, that suggests then that some people came from there. There was some influence from there, and those people won over a following to worshipping this god. And then, one thing leads to another, stories develop, and eventually Yahweh acquires a new personality in the biblical stories. The whole process takes a few hundred years.
Do you think there was a united monarchy, or do you think that there were just two different locales where Yahweh kind of separately grows and they work together somewhat?
I don't have any objection to the idea of a united monarchy. I don't see that it's particularly problematic. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a fact. We don't really have independent evidence of it. But that you have a very strong sense in later times that these were really very closely related peoples. So, I don't see any great problem with the idea of there being a united monarchy. But if somebody actually came up with evidence that there wasn't, hard to prove a negative, but I wouldn't have a problem with that either. But there surely was a sense that they were one people before they developed a monarchy at all.
Interesting.
Now, you see, if there wasn't a united monarchy, what then? David presumably would just have been a southern chieftain. And then you would just have grandiose claims by the southern kingdom. But, there's no evidence on that one way or the other. And in that case, I'm as happy to go with the biblical account.
And then the final one in this vein is that there's this, the Conquest. So obviously, I've interviewed Ronald Hindle. I'm sure you know who Dr. Hindle is.
Yes.
Yeah, he actually did the cultural memory argument of the Exodus and did a fantastic job explaining the highland, the whole thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that even if they weren't in Egypt, even though he does think there were definite Hebrews or these types of Canaanites over in Egypt, that also Canaan was ruled by them, and they would go and pick up slaves or, have them do tasks for them and slave for them. So the fact that when Egypt collapses, it's kind of this whole, our God did it, now we can.
Oh, yeah.
So the Conquest, though, we didn't really get too deep into that. I'm trying to explain how these peaceful, no-walled Canaanites who move into the highlands are now these warriors fighting these battles against all these different...
Well, again, we're dependent here on archaeology. That's the only control we have. Now, most of the sites that are destroyed in the book of Joshua were not destroyed at the appropriate time in history. Jericho being the showcase example. Jericho apparently hadn't been a walled city for some time before that. There are a few places like Hatzor that were destroyed. Now, whether they were destroyed by Israelites is another question, because they could have been destroyed also by Philistines, by people coming in from the coast. But the consensus is, that the massive conquest described in Joshua did not happen. The question then becomes, who made up that story and why? And now, the story, there's an evangelical scholar named Lawson Younger who has a good book on this, on how the story of the conquest is certainly resembles, possibly is modeled on Assyrian conquest. That the Assyrians boasted they left nobody alive. Well, Joshua is going to match that. Now, when would this have been written?
Right.
This is a very difficult question. Some people thought in the time of Josiah. But now it doesn't really seem to me that Josiah carried out any great violent conquests either. Was it sometime after the return from the exile? Was this something, an ideological document? It surely is an ideological document that's saying you should have nothing to do with the peoples of the land. Now, from that point of view, this might be somewhat congenial to what you get in the Book of Ezra. It's the anti-Samaritan argument that you really should not leave any of the native peoples alive in that part of the world. Possibly written in there somewhere, but I don't really have a good answer as to where the Book of Joshua comes from. I'm editing a big commentary by Tom Dozeman. He published the first half of it, and he has a very complicated idea. He thinks it was written in northern Israel, and that doesn't make sense to me.
Interesting.
But
do you think?
But it's a tough one.
You think Philistine people actually would convert and come and join? Do you think at any time in history they ever joined? Maybe some of them.
The Israelites?
Yeah.
Not much. No, the Philistines actually seem to have been a relatively cultured people. Larry Steger thought they were Greeks. That they came in from the West. Said, but Philistine culture, as you got it in a place like Ashkelon, was a bit more sophisticated, whereas the villages up in the highlands, these were crude. That's one of the striking things about them, is that there seemed to have been a breakdown in civilization.
Thank you.